Let's look at what becomes the dominant landscape here in Hawaii for pretty much a century and a half. In fact, you could argue in many ways, as the Trash sisters do, that the plantations basically become the hotel industry of the late 20th century. There's actually some real interesting parallels we'll see later. But the plantation period is really key for a number of reasons. It is the period in which the pretty much American influence starts to become dominant versus what had been sort of a mixed British, French, American, sort of classic Pacific Island exploitation system, sandalwood, various other plant materials and such. All of a sudden, that shift when the plantations come in. The plantation period is really, really key here, as it is everywhere in the Pacific, when it comes in, because it's an absolutely massive change in the way that people see the world around them. We went through this a little bit in our time about this whole sort of changing things that occur during the monarchy, with the idea that land starts to get value and then places start to be defined. The plantation was and still is the classic example of where you've changed the view of landscape from basically sustainable food. So if you think of a Hawaiian landscape, pre-European, even in the early 19th century, it was a landscape in which it fed people. People lived on it. People produced and ate the food off of it. And so the landscape and the people had a very close nurturing relationship. You needed the land to feed you. You survived because the land survived. And so you were very careful about what you did to the land because you weren't stupid. You knew that you needed that food or else you were going to starve to death. And we know from records that in the late pre-European period, there were a number of famines that occurred here in the Hawaiian Islands where there had become too many people and there wasn't enough food on the landscape, in times of drought or something like that. So all this changes radically when we move to the concept of plantation. The plantations, which of course start hundreds of years earlier as a place like the Caribbean and other such, move into Hawaii. First plantations occur in the 1830s, but plantations don't really get going as an industry until the 1850s, 1860s, in part just because the main plantation crop here was sugar. But the problem you had with sugar production is one, it was already competing with the Caribbean and other places in the world which had sugar, which were a lot cheaper to export to Europe and the United States. And so Hawaiian sugar was not profitable initially. So and they also didn't have a lot of the folks that were into sugar here really didn't know how to do sugar properly. And so the sugar here was considered very low quality. But they finally figure out how to improve that. And then of course their huge logic basis is basically the west coast of the United States, because by the 1850s, not the 1840s, by the 1850s, early 1860s, the population on the west coast of the United States has just ballooned. With the gold rush and settlers moving west and everything, there was a huge population increase. And these folks wanted sugar. They wanted stuff, to put in their coffee or whatever they were going to drink. And so Hawaii suddenly found itself in a situation that it had pretty much a captive market. Sugar produced in, say, southern United States and the Caribbean was very difficult to get that to the West Coast, very expensive. And so Hawaii found itself in a situation that really had a market built for it. And so sugar production, the idea that you could make money off of sugar, just became absolutely huge. Now, prior to this, ranching had been a big industry. Ranching was started by Kamehameha I, with advice from George Vancouver when he comes over here on the second British expedition. But Vancouver just suggested to him that having meat animals, the meat could be taken, put into basically preserved what we call salt meat, and then it would be sold to ships. And the reasoning behind this was that by the 1790 period, the Hawaiian population really didn't have a lot to sell to European and American ships, even though they wanted the goods on those ships. So they were sort of in a situation they wanted stuff, but they didn't have any money. And so ranching and raising animals and then butchering the animals and selling the meat off the animals was a quick and fairly easy way to get back in a market, to have something the Europeans wanted and needed. So you would trade the meat basically for European goods. And Kamehameha was all over this because he wanted guns, he wanted military weaponry, he wanted skilled European and American metal tools, etc. And the only way to get that was the cash, and the only cash you could basically find other than sandalwood was through ranching. So ranching was instigated by the Hawaiian chiefs, specifically Kamehameha most successfully, had huge environmental impacts, especially on the Big Island. But it really wasn't, it was limited to particular areas. It was a pretty haphazard business in the way they ran it. But the enormous change, and there really wasn't that much money in it. It was fine in the late 17, early 1800s when the number of ships was small and, every buck counted. But by the 1840s, there wasn't enough money in ranching. And also, of course, by the 1840s, you already had large ranches starting up in the western part of the United States, which again was your other export market. So you were competing with American meat, basically. And so that pretty much fizzes out. When sugar comes in, then sugar serves two functions. One is becomes the major revenue stream in the Hawaiian Islands. If you want to, sugar in the 19th century was the equivalent of tourism in 2023. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is for folks that were looking to make a lot of money quick. In other words, for the Hawaiian version of Virginia City, for the Hawaiian version of coming over here, making a lot of money, and then going home, wherever that might be, wealthy. Sugar was the way to get there. You could do it relatively easily, at least initially. There wasn't a lot of competition. You had a captive market. So it pretty much fit the criteria for, making a buck fast. And so sugar becomes key. Now, the key thing about sugar is that what happens is now you look at the landscape entirely differently. The landscape prior to this, as I mentioned earlier, was a sustainability landscape. It was a landscape that fed you. There was an intimate relationship with the landscape. In a sugar or plantation-based landscape, the function of the land is to grow money. So basically, there's no difference between sugar, pineapple, pakalolo, whatever. They're all the same thing. They're all cash crops. So the function of the land now is to generate money, and it does that through growing something that you then sell. So you're not going to eat this. You're not going to eat the sugar. You're not going to eat the pineapple. You're not going to eat the macadamia nuts, whatever it might be. You're raising them so you then sell them to someone else, and with that money, you buy your food. So you've now dislocated yourself from basically sustainability. This is no longer subsistence agriculture. It's what we call cash cropping. And that's a very good way to remember this, the idea of cash cropping. Once you've cash cropped the landscape, once you see the landscape in terms of how much money you can make off of it, that very quickly becomes the only way that you see the landscape. And this is still the center of a lot of the huge conflicts that you see here in the 21st century here in Hawaii, in terms of one group saying, well, we should keep this property just because whatever. And another group saying, well, but then we can't make as much money off of it. A good example would be Airbnb. You have a neighborhood, but if you have, Airbnb, tourism residences in there, the folks with them are saying, well, I have the right to make money off of my house. The other folks are saying, well, you've disrupted the neighborhood. But the reality is, especially in the American legal system that we're a part of, making money off the land is more legitimate than any other thing. It's much easier to win a court case, even at the level of Supreme Court, if you're arguing that you're making money off a property. It's really difficult to win or even get them to hear a case where you're saying, well, some sort of an emotional relationship or a religious relationship or a social relationship with the landscape, because the first thing they want to know is, well, how much is it worth? So this whole idea of consumerism becomes absolutely central. And if you think about it, all the way back in Williamsburg and our American landscapes, we see that because those folks are migrants to that part of New England. They're then whacking what, the forest and other areas around there, and they're turning those into farms. And they consume some of the farm products, but they're making surpluses and they sell the surpluses. With the surpluses, they generate, that generates cash, and they use the cash for everything from, a bigger house to glass in the windows to white paint for the picket fence. So the Calvinist view of North America was that the North American landscape was a landscape in which you could make money off of it. And so being a success, which translated to cash, was very easy to do in North America. That was the attraction of migrating to North America. And of course, when you look at places like Virginia City, that's the whole reason for that landscape. The only reason you move to someplace like Virginia City is to make money off of it. And then when you've got it, you actually just pack up and leave. That's why they have ghost towns. So the plantations coming here in the 19th century, in the mid 19th century, bring this whole mental attitude to the landscape. So let's take a look at one. Okay, here's an image from 1910, or early 1900s, of the Wailuku Mill and the plantation office. So the plantation system was basically you grew sugar. The sugar was then cut. The sugar was taken to the mill here. The sugar was then heated, boiled, processed. The excess was burned off, and then the remainder was what we call raw sugar, now brown sugar. That sugar was then actually rather bizarrely, when you think about it, the sugar from all the mills, including like Wailuku, was actually packed raw, sent to Northern California to a town called Sprecklesville in the Bay, in San Francisco Bay Area, at which point it was then processed and turned into white sugar. Now you still can buy this, of course. This is the classic, pink and white package of CNH sugar, the white crystal sugar that's not very good for you. And you can still buy raw sugar. It's now, in some cases, pretty expensive if you buy it like Whole Foods or someplace like that. But it used to be even in the 1970s, if, where I used to live, you used to be able to go down to the Lehui mill and just get bags of sugar for free. They just, had more than they know what to do with. So the function of the mill was to convert green plants, i.e. sugarcane, into brown raw sugar, at which point that sugar was then sent off to somewhere else for final form. So the bizarre thing is if this person here wants to actually put white sugar in their coffee, even though they're literally growing, they're growing the sugar here, they're making the sugar here. If they want the white sugar, that sugar will have traveled 5,000 miles from here to California to back again to be put in the plantation store and plantation office for sale by someone here to consume white sugar. There was a huge status thing that white sugar was more upscale than brown sugar. Raw sugar meant that you were really poor and you couldn't afford white sugar. So white sugar was like the Gucci version. Brown sugar was the Ross's, Walmart version. And so what you had was this enormous concept of landscape. So these landscapes, these two images, same place. This landscape now is how much money can you make off of it per acre? How much money can you make off of it per plantation? This has absolutely nothing in common with the Hawaiian landscape. This whole area, for example, Wailuku Mill area, I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly where the plantation office was, it's gone. But this area was all in wet fields. This was all loi. So this would have been a dalo. So in the Hawaiian system, this was subsistence, sustainable agriculture. The plantation system comes in, they plow that all out. They then clear all the stones, the rock walls out of it, and they turn into sugar production. Now, the other part of this then is, let's pause and take another look. Here we see, Market Street. This is still Wailuku. Market Street, I think one of these buildings is actually still there somewhere. So when you're looking at this now, if you think about this looks almost exactly like Virginia City. It's not really a Main Street, late 19th century American town in the way that, say, the main streets are like that, where it's trying to be, but it's still very temporary, very ephemeral. It's very much with the idea that many of the folks here aren't really planning to live their entire lives here. And the folks that actually work on the plantation, so the folks that are the actual plantation labor force, which initially is Chinese, then Japanese, then Koreans, then Norwegians, you name it. Later Okinawans, and then final large group would be the different Filipino populations. They all live in these barracks. So, for example, this particular barracks probably would hold maybe about 25, 35, 40 people in it, all sleeping in, cots or, racked, areas like that. There'd be a common shared bath area. There'd be a common sort of kitchen area for each barrack. So that's how the population that actually cut the cane, that did the physical labor, lived. They lived in these places. And when they got a little bit of money, which was hard to come by because of the plantation store scam, where basically you never got paid in cash, you got paid in, sort of like credits, almost like, it was basically credits. And then you had to cash the credits in at the plantation store. Same thing you do, for example, if you fly Hawaiian Air and then somehow they screw up. So they give you a, certificate that you can use on your next flight. You can't transfer it to another airlines, you got to use them. So the plantation system not only had the people captive in these barracks, but they also had them captive in terms of where they could spend their money. And the plantation made very, very carefully sure that the amount of money they were given in salary was not quite enough to cover the cost of their expenses for food and other stuff to live on. And so that way they guaranteed the plantation force was essentially not slave labor, but it was certainly contractually, subservient labor. And that way the plantations could increase their profit margins. The plantations paid almost nothing for labor. They made some of that money back because you had to go here. We'll say this is the plantation store. You had to buy everything from the plantation store. So the plantation was marking up the prices and making money back from you, ironically, then, even though you were working for them. And then, of course, they then go around and sell the sugar for as much as they can get for it. So the plantations were making money hand over fist in the 19th century, and they were doing really, really well. But most importantly here is, again, this would have been, Market Street would have been probably dry fields. So this probably would have been some, maybe some breadfruit, but largely in Wailuku it would have been, dryland yams. It would have been dryland dalo. Largest probably was all in sweet potato, and there would have been, the thatched, sleeping area residence areas that we would have seen the last time. And this would have been the same thing. Camp houses would have all been agricultural land. Because in the Hawaiian system, anything that could grow food had to be used for food because you needed all the food you could get. In this system, you're not interested if people starve. As long as the folks that own the property are making money off of it, they don't care. The only reason for being concerned about whether the labor here on the plantation starves is if they starve, they're not going to be cutting cane, you're going to lose money. But as long as you can keep them above starvation, but minimize your cost, your labor cost, and then maximize your profit margin, then you're a happy camper, which is still, the way the American sort of relationship of for-profit private sector industry and then the labor force tends to still reflect the same phenomena. Now, what that means is if you're a Hawaiian and say you're from Maui, as you look at this landscape, in 1860 versus the same landscape in say 1820, when it was still your landscape, and this landscape could be Martian for all you know. It has nothing to do, there's no values that reflect anything about the Hawaiian value system or Hawaiian concept of place, Hawaiian value of the land. There's no relationship to the land. You'd be horrified at thinking what your ancestors might think of what this place has turned into. And so for Hawaiians, pretty much they were given a choice. If you were Hawaiian and you decided, well, this is the way the world's going to be, then you're going to try to find a job on the plantation. You're going to try to find a job or start up a store here. And you're going to become part of this westernized, largely Americanized, assimilated system of the mid-late 20th century and 19th century. In which you're going to make this miniature version of San Francisco. Your other alternative, if you're Hawaiian, is to basically say, no, I'm not having anything to do with this. This is too different. It's not what I signed up for when I was born. And so you're going to move to parts of the environment here in Hawaii, places in Hawaii that didn't have this system, or either it couldn't take place because it wasn't the proper area to grow sugar, or it was too far, too distant. They couldn't make enough money off of it, so it didn't happen. So you moved to Hana, you moved to my area of East Maui, Kahiki Nui, you moved to upper northwest Maui. And in areas, what then you get is largely Hawaiian communities that tend to be pretty conservative and in many cases still hold to the older value systems of this point in time versus the, basically, if you would, Americanized value system of the mid-late 19th century. In other words, between 1830 and 1870, the Hawaiian environment largely changes from a, if you would, Hawaiian valued environment, sustainable subsistence agriculture, to a for-profit, maximize your return environment that looks exactly the same as California or Iowa or any place else like that. That was the enormous change, in the plantations were the center of that. So let's take a look at the difference. Look at this again. Think of the folks that are living in here. People literally squashed in each other. Again, probably 30 to 40 folks in this one structure here. If you ever want to see this in still an extent, the best of the plantations that are still almost entirely there would be the Punene plantation, which is the last one to shut down. Here's the actual plantation. Oops. Now notice how when we look around here, we've got all this area that basically this was all sugar. In fact, most of it actually is still sugar. It's not being harvested, but it's still sugar. And so what you've got is this massive area. All the sugar from this area then was then cut and hauled originally by hand and then by draft animals, especially water buffalo, and then by trains and then trucks here to the mill, where it's then processed and turned into that raw sugar, which is then sent down to the harbor here in Wailuku, where it's then packed on ships, goes off to California to be turned into processed white sugar, which is then sold throughout the American West and actually ironically here. So if you visualize those barracks, there were, I think, 14 camps that were tied to Punene Sugar Mill alone. And each of those camps looked like that one we saw. Here's what happens if you're part of the elites. This is the, This is one of the plantation manager offices, and this is one of the LUNAs, or senior, basically land supervisors. So the folks that had power and authority in the plantation, the folks that ran everything, not the folks cutting the cane, they didn't live in barracks. They lived in very, very nice houses. And these nice houses reflected the status and prestige of being part of the elite management team, if you would, versus the immigrant, physical labor in the fields team. And this is the huge difference in the plantation system. You get this spectacular example of social segregation based on power and money between the plantation owners, and right below them, this wouldn't have been the owners, this would have been the plantation managers. In fact, I think that is the plantation manager's house, but it's also the office. And then what you go is you go tiered down, and then boom, at the bottom, you end up with the massive workforce. Because you have to remember, in the 19th century, things weren't done by machines. And with the exception of the mill itself, everything else was done by human labor. It's one human powered machine. It's the same way we use the term one horsepower now. And that's the way things worked. So when we zoom out, all of this was plantation land. In fact, most of it was plantation, was still being planted in cane right into the 1990s. And there's still some of these, some of the old villages, which actually the plantation settlements are still there. Very few of them are actually left intact, but there's still, memories of them. So all of this was sugar land. Now, all of this had been other types of land. It becomes sugar land in the 19th century with this idea of changing. Sorry, I'm doing two things at once here. With the idea of changing the landscape into, that's not exactly what's over here. This for-profit, for-cash landscape. Okay, here's the paella mill. What's left of it? It's only about 40% around there. And here's their field office. This is where all the work was. The only folks that would be in here on a regular basis would be management. And they lived in very, very nice houses. I'm not sure if any of the paella homes are still there. I've never bothered to look. But they lived in very, very nice, luxurious mansions. In fact, the actual owners lived in very obviously very, very, Southern style mansions, which was how the plantations worked. They sort of emulated themselves on sort of the American South in terms of plantation houses, which is funny because many of the plantation owners are originally actually Calvinist. So this idea of real ostentatious, pillared, colonnaded, Southern mansions really wasn't part of the Calvinist heritage. But by the mid-late 19th century, it was very much in the idea of the American heritage of screaming, "I've got money, wealth, and power, and here it is, and you don't." So if you think about that barracks would have been the people who worked there. The only time they would have come up to this building is if they got their monthly chit, which basically was how much they, were going to get paid, indirectly, or if they got into trouble or they needed to request something like that. That's the only time they would be here. This was, to most of the plantation, this was a huge symbol, and it's not by accident that it's built the way it is. It's built to look, sort of neo-Spanish missionary colonial, whatever. But it's more importantly, it's basically a substantial building. And if you think about it, it's very different than this building. This is obviously a purely functional building for keeping the rain off of the equipment. This, on the other hand, is very much a statement of sophistication, power, civilization in the 19th century, and classic, go for profit, private sector industry success. Okay, here we see a relatively small one. This is actually the Victoria Ward estate. So this is actually right where Blaisdell Center is now. That was the Victoria Ward property. They were not a plantation in the sense of a sugar plantation, but they were into dairy and raising cattle and such like that, sort of a minor ranching operation, which is the Victoria Ward estate. But the house is a classic plantation house. So this is a classic Hawaii plantation house from the mid-late 19th century. And if you notice, it looks very, very, very like what you'd see in the American South or the Caribbean. I think in many cases, what they actually do is they tried to emulate the British in places like Singapore, because this is a very Singapore look to it. But what you have again is this very, very, expansive statement of wealth. This had a long drive leading up here that you went through here. It had, planted coconut palms, a beautiful garden on either side, probably peacocks wandering around there is very typical of this group. And then what you had is this very ostentatious place in the middle, which made this enormous statement of power and wealth. Now, another version, ironically not quite the same, but a very spectacular similarity can be seen here. The Moana's is now called Moana Surfrider, I think, or something like that. The Moana Hotel was actually a copy, an enlarged copy of the castle estate that existed in Waititi and Waikiki down towards Queens. Back in the 19th century, the castle was one of the huge, still are, the castle and Cook are still one of the huge families here in terms of wealth and power, due to their property, which was originally plantations. And so the plantation house that they had was basically about 2/3 of what you see here. But again, this idea of very ostentatious, very grandiose, screaming, "I've got a ton of money," which, if you think about it, going all the way back to the colonists period, the colonists would be a little perturbed at the sort of over the top scale of all this. But the idea that wealth and power were moral, in the sense that the castles had to be good people because they had a lot of wealth and power and they had a big building, there, that is still part of the American logic. The plan was expanded, and that became the Moana Hotel, which is actually intended to look like a plantation home from the period in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's the last extent one that still has its original sort of look to the front of it. And so if you look at this, you think of this as a residence, you needed a staff, God knows how many, just to keep the place clean and keep it up and stuff like that. And that was another manifestation of power. Not only the cost of the building, but the cost of upkeep. The fact that you would have had a large lawn on every side and a garden, and you would have gardeners, with literally scissors cutting the grass. This sort of mind and monitor, sort of mind blowing, expenditure, to make nothing but a statement on the landscape about the power you've got versus the guys living in the barracks that we saw a little bit earlier. So what happens in the plantations? The plantations make explicit the relationship of landscape and most specifically built environment to power, authority, and wealth. And in Hawaii, the power, authority, and wealth are the same thing as they are in the US mainland. The amount of property you own is pretty much symptomatic of the power you've got. The size of the house you own is symptomatic of the power and the wealth you have. They're all a sort of seamless package. And they're not very closely tied at all to, for example, inheritance. So again, you have to remember, given the Calvinist logic, if you inherited something like this, that was actually bad because you hadn't worked for it. This would be sort of, I think it's some of the really wealthy folks in the United States, I can't remember their names, actually don't give their kids much of their money. With that, their kids have to work to make their own money. And that's so Calvinist, it sort of makes you, shocked. The Calvinists would love it, all these years later. So this type of view, this type of look, this type of statement, even though in this case it's a hotel, but even if you think about that sort of telling, because when it's originally built, it was to emulate a plantation home. And you can still see the plantation homes if you go up New Mono Avenue, towards the Poly. If you look on the left and right hand side, a lot of the embassies are actually some of the old plantation houses. I couldn't find good images in Google. They're not showing up very clearly. So there's still some of those places around. But the enormous drastic gap between the workers, if you would, and the owners on the other hand. And then, of course, you have the third group, which would be the Hawaiians who've decided they don't want to have anything with either part of this, and then move off to parts of the islands where that isn't happening. For example, Makaha, or Waialua, or Waimanalo, for example, on this island, where Hawaiian populations don't want to be part of this world, try to keep what they can of the world that they had that used to be here. And this stunning change occurs in about 40 or 50 years. It's a very, very short period of time for this to happen. And the consequences here were stunning because, of course, this is still the landscape we live in now. Now it's hotels and tourists. If you want to think of it in a really sort of strange way, the tourists walking down the street here are the new version of sugarcane.